For this gown, I decided to reuse a corset and hoop skirt that I've previously made. It really isn't necessary to make a whole new set of undergarments every time I start a new project, even if I really want to. So I used this corset from my Mina Harker gown, which you can see me make from the timestamps 550 to 1621 in this video over here on making my Mina Harker dress. And then I have another video that's a deep dive on making a hoop skirt, specifically a hoop skirt that can hold over 30 pounds of weight. And I have that video over here. Check those videos out if you would like to know how I made those two garments. The first new garment that I made for this costume was a green petticoat. I used my own petticoat pattern that I developed for my Sally ball gown in 2020. So you can purchase that on my website, or you can just go ahead and start doing math and the sky's the limit. I used 15 yards of mint crystal organza from Fabric Wholesale Direct, and they actually sponsored fabric for this costume, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then I also needed to supplement the petticoat fabric with about 10 yards of this other green fabric that I had. This is another crystal organza. They're not quite the same color, but I think it'll do, and I'm gonna have the mint green as like the staple, and this one will just kind of be hiding underneath. So let's discuss how I put this together.
Instead of printing and cutting out new pattern pieces, I just measured the pieces from my pattern and used my rotary tool, ruler, and cutting mat to cut out my pieces. For the pieces that needed to be half the width of fabric, I just cut them with my scissors and then labeled the tier and layer and set it aside to cut the next piece. Now that I have 5 piles of fabric for the 5 layers of this petticoat, it's time to set up my sewing area. I live in a 600 square foot apartment, and my living room is my studio. So my Aero sewing table and cutting table have been key to my success in this space. I'll be using my serger to finish the edges on my fabric.
All right, so here are my organized piles, and you can see where I had to go into a different stash of green. It's okay though, we're gonna see all of this. These will be the top layers, that'll be the bottom layer. On these ones, actually, like I cut everything salvage to salvage, just like I normally would, but on these ones, the salvage actually is raw. So if you see, this is salvage, and that's still not cute, but this is raw. Like, it's gonna fray. So we need to overlock all these. I set up my overlock machine. So I'm gonna overlock these edges.
The first step was to serge the short edges that were raw. Then I actually filled 3 bobbins with green thread. I ended up needing more than 3 bobbins, but having a few made at the beginning helps keep me from task switching so often. Starting on layer 1, tier 1, I'm going to sew my strips of fabric together, press the seam open, and then I can serge the top and bottom of tiers 1 and 2 for each layer. For tier 3, I'm just serging the top and leaving the bottom ready to hem.
All right, this is the bottom tier, and this is like the bottom edge of the tier. I will be hemming this, so I'm actually gonna leave it unserged for right now. This is the top. So I've got one whole layer basically serged. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna go to all of the layers, and starting with tier 1 for all of the layers and get those knocked out, and then tier 2 and then tier 3. So I'm gonna keep everything labeled though and pinned in piles, and I'm actually gonna move the piles from here onto the floor for a little while so that like I can visually see this pile of fabric disappear, if that makes any sense. So that's where I'm at. Let's get to it. Okay, so I have everything in piles already. Now I have to hem the bottom, and to hem the bottom, I'm going to use ribbon. You can also use a rolled hem foot, or can you hear Eva? Can you just hear her? You see her? She's like, oh mommy, I gotta be in the video. She just blends in. Yeah. So anyway, you can use a rolled hem foot. You can also roll the edges on your serger, and you can use bias tape too, but I have this ribbon, so I want to use it. A lot of like this petticoat making process is materials I already had. That's what we're doing, so I'm going to show you that process.
The first step was to press the ribbon in half. I burned the edge of the ribbon on my candle so that it wouldn't fray. Then I pinned the ribbon to the hem, making sure that the ribbon sandwiched the raw edge. I moved on to the next segment of hem and continued this process over and over until the ribbon was completely pinned along the hem of the third tier. Now I can take it over to my machine and stitch it down. I did this with a 4mm stitch length and then pressed the ribbon one more time, and the hem was done. Once all 5 hems were completed, I used my ruffle foot to ruffle the top of tier 3 down, then the top of tier 2, and finally the top of tier 1. I did this for all 5 layers. Now it's time to build the petticoat. To build the petticoat, I start by pinning the ruffled edge of tier 3 to the straight edge of tier 2. If the ruffled edge is too long, I add a few pleats in the middle of the tier to help them end up the same length. Then I sew them together with the right sides together, and I can pin the ruffled side of tier 2 to the straight side of tier 1, repeating for every layer. I do offer hands-on petticoat making workshops at conventions that provide sewing machine workshops. So if you are interested in taking this class with me, make sure to reach out to your local convention about having me to teach. Now, let's put this all together on a waistband. I like to use cotton for my waistband because it's stronger than organza and is less likely to warp out of shape. I start by folding my waistband in half with the right sides together, mark ½ inch, pin it, and then sew the 2 sides together. From there, I clip the corners, flip the right side out, and press my strip of fabric in half. Then on one half, I fold and press ½ inch inside. This will be the wrong side of the waistband. Finally, I add the top tiers of the petticoat to the waistband by pinning them with the right side of the petticoat to the right side of the waistband. I sew them down, then I sew the back seams up, leaving an 8-inch gap from the waistband to where I'm going to sew. I use dress hooks for the closures on my petticoats, and then it's ready for maximum twirling.
Now let's get started on a garment that you actually will get to see when I wear this costume, and that's going to be the flounced skirt. This was heavily inspired by Lydia Dietz's red wedding dress from the movie. If you would like to see me make that gown, let me know in the comments below. It's been on my list for a while, so maybe we can make it happen. Okay, so a quick disclaimer on the skirt and bodice patterns I'm using. I am using truly Victorian patterns. My beliefs personally don't align with the beliefs of the owner of this company, so I no longer financially support them. However, I did have this pattern from 2018 and I don't really feel comfortable just throwing away something that's useful. So I'm using it for this costume. You can do your own research to decide if you would like to purchase from them or find another seller of a similar skirt structure. So throwing that out there. Now that the awkward stuff is over, let's talk about making the skirt. So the black and white striped cotton poplin was actually sponsored by Fabric Wholesale Direct. They sent me 10 yards of this fabric. I think I'm only gonna need about 7, but having a little bit more is always better. They gifted me this fabric to use specifically for this costume. However, my thoughts and opinions on this are all my own. They're not paying me to say anything. I also personally love the feel and the body of this fabric. It feels like this would be a really good fabric for a Katrina Von Tassel from Sleepy Hollow gown, the black and white striped one she wears at the very, very end of the movie. I am also pairing this striped poplin with a just quilter's cotton from Joann. It's a white quilter's cotton. I think I got 5 yards of it, and it's really so that it can be the base of the skirt and then all the ruffles can go live on top of it. I was afraid that if I had the stripes as the base and the ruffles that they would clash and you would have this like weird visual thing going on. So having the white background I thought would be really powerful for the stripes to just pop. All right, let's make this skirt.
Knowing that the fabric above the first ruffle is going to be seen, I marked a ½ inch on each side of that ruffle line on the pattern and cut the white cotton with seam allowance for the lower portion of the skirt and the striped poplin for the upper portion of the skirt. I've been making my job really easy on this costume and have been just serging all of the edges of all of my pieces. The alternative to this is sewing everything with French seams or flat felled seams, depending on which ones you prefer. I stitched the striped top to the white bottom for each of the 4 skirt base panels. Then I stitched all 4 panels together, leaving the back panel open for now. For the hem, I measured 2 inches from the bottom and then folded and pressed ½ inch and folded again on the 2-inch line. Pressed, pinned, and stitched it in place. Later in the process, I learned that I wanted my green petticoat to peek out just a little, so I had to bring this hem up by another 6 inches by folding, pressing, pinning, and sewing it all over again. Moving on to the striped ruffles, I cut out my fabric according to each pattern piece, with the stripes going up and down, just like BeetleJuice's costume in the movie. I serged the side edges, then I pinned each strip together to make the larger ruffle portion and stitched them together with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I can serge the top and bottom edge of the ruffle. At this point, I iron my strips of fabric and then I press the bottom edge up by 1/2 inch and stitch it down to create the hem of the ruffle. For the top ruffle, I also folded the top edge down by 1/2 inch, and when I pinned it to my base skirt, I made sure to also have that top piece pinned in so you couldn't see a serged edge. Now I can pin each ruffle according to the markings on the pattern, adding pleats throughout the ruffle so that they end up the same size as the base. I also decided to add a placket into the back for the closure because I didn't like the instructions from the pattern. Then I could sew the back panel together. Finally, I pleated the top of the base skirt to fit within the waistband, added dress hooks. This part is now ready for embroidery.
And once again, the bodice is a truly Victorian pattern, but I did modify it a little bit. So I'm using a different sleeve pattern and I got rid of the Bertha and I'm using just like a ruffled lace on the bodice. I drew inspiration from Wednesday Addams' Raven Dance dress that she wears in the TV show. It's like the black, lacy, fluffy dress. I'm pulling a little bit of inspiration from that, as well as still pulling a little bit from Lydia Dietz's wedding dress. So that's kind of where we get that black lace from. This lace was also supplied by Fabric Wholesale Direct. It is a stretch lace. Since I'm going to be wearing it as a sleeve, I really need it to stretch, but it also has a really good body for ruffling down to make like a nice cute little lace ruffle on the neckline. So I'm really happy with this material, and I actually only was able to get it in gray. They were out of black in stock. I wonder why. I mean, we all know. We all know black and white are the ones that most commonly go fast. I decided to go with gray because I'm gonna dye this fabric black, which it's been a minute since I've dyed some lace. So let's get to it.
I started by cutting my lace pieces out first and ended up using my Spirit Elsa sleeve pattern for the sleeves on this bodice. I filled my dye pot with water, heated it up to boiling, rinsed my fabric pieces, added my dye to the water, then added my pieces to the water and cooked my fabric for an hour. While my lace was drying, I cut out my pattern pieces on both white cotton and on the striped poplin. From there, I flatlined the pieces together and then serged everything. There's no time for lining and such on this project. Now, let's check in on my lace. It looks good enough to me, so let's continue. I added the darts to the front pieces. Then folded back the edge of the back for the boning channel, stitched the side back piece to the back piece, and then added the grommets with my handy dandy grommet press. Once my grommets were in place, I could sew the front to the back at the sides, add boning, and stitch in all of the lace elements.
This is the part of the video where we talk about death. Don't worry, it's not serious death. We're just talking about the dead bugs that I sewed onto my gown. I have saved Victorian death and mourning practices for another project though, so I don't know. You might hear that pop up at some point in the future, maybe. Who knows? But first, I think there's a better location for this. Let's go on an adventure. I have brought you to the cemetery. We are here to discuss the history of beetlewing embroidery, otherwise known as Victorian elytra embroidery. These are, in fact, real beetle wings that I will be using on this gown. They are from the Jewel Beetle. I'll put their actual Latin name right here. I can't pronounce it. So these are ethically sourced because they are actually a byproduct of the food industry, these beetles only live about 3 or 4 weeks, and so they're easy to come by, easy to source. I bought about 200 of them for this project. Let's talk a little bit about where this embroidery came from. The name Elytra embroidery, it comes from the name of the hard shell casing that covers the beetle's wings. For jewel beetles, their elytra can come in many different colors. Specifically, the green with the purple shift is what's most commonly seen. Like many other embroidery techniques, elytra embroidery became popular in the 18th century in India. This was during the British colonization of India, and this embroidery actually started to become a symbol of wealth and status for English women. However, it is believed that elytra was used in embroidery and household adornment since the 17th or even 16th centuries. It's really important to understand that this technique was popularized because of colonialism, and the use of elytra as sequins was appropriated from India. The most famous use of elytra on a gown is actually Charles Worth's peacock dress, which you can Google to learn a little bit more information about. We're not going to be talking about that in this video. I'll link a few articles below so you can learn a little bit more about the history of elytra embroidery and see some examples of how it was used in Victorian fashion and even into the Edwardian era. But now let's actually embroider some beetle wings.
There's 2 ways you can buy beetle wings, drilled and undrilled. This just means there's a hole drilled into the top of the wing to be able to sew it down. I have drilled beetle wings, but I will show you how to embroider them both ways. For the drilled beetle wings, I'm using embroidery floss, but you can use embroidery thread or floss on both ways to attach the wing. I start by single threading my needle, so I have a short tail and a long tail of thread, and I knot the long tail. With my thumb, I'm going to hold the beetle wing in place and then bring my needle through to the right side of the fabric and through the drilled hole. Then I stitch down to the top of the wing, and I come back through the hole from the back and stitch down up to the top of the wing again. The next step is to stitch halfway down the beetle wing, creating a new puncture in the wing. Then, stitching down on one side of the wing, bring the needle back through the puncture and stitch down on the opposite side of the wing. Historically, elytra embroidery was paired with gold work embroidery, and therefore gold thread. I have this beautiful goldenrod embroidery thread from Sulky that I think will be fun to play with for this sample. Since this way of adding beetle wings is pretty tricky, I'm just going to share a diagram of where I am stitching and then just show a sped up attempt of me following that diagram. There were moments where I definitely felt like I didn't have enough hands for this technique, but I would love to practice it and try to implement it in a costume in the future. Now that you know a couple of ways to embroider beetle wings, let's pair this with moss embroidery. I'm using a French knot to make the moss. To do this, I'm bringing my needle to the right side of my fabric. I am pointing the needle to the left, wrapping my thread around it twice, then bring my needle through the fabric right next to the spot I came out of, holding the thread taut so that my knot is nice and tight, but not too tight. I just repeat this over and over again until it kind of looks like moss. I don't really have a plan for where I'm putting all of these. I basically am just playing with changing the thread color, trying to use the moss on the seam areas, and then adding beetle wings in a way that looks good to me.
All right, this is a pretty decent sample. If you can see, my knots look kind of cool. They kind of look moss-like. This was supposed to be like a little row of like moss knots going over it. That didn't quite work, but I'm still gonna play with this idea when I get it on the actual fabric. But I kind of like it. I think I'll build up a little bit more, but I think my plan is to attach the beetle wing in the area, like find an area, attach the beetle wing, and then knot around it, and then also add a little bit of this, can't remember, the turkey work or whatever, and do a little bit of it throughout to kind of give it a little bit of a texture play. And then if I really want to, I can also add some, like try this again here. But I think I'm gonna just move on to the actual dress because there's no point in like continuing to play. I will say something I did like, but it is hard on the back. Having the multiple like colors already done and then just playing in between them, I know that's a little hard versus like trying to do all of one color and then go in and add highlights and lowlights. So I might try that, and then just like, we won't, like that's so bad.
That's real bad, y'all. But like, whatever, who cares? It's just for fun. So, we'll see.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to Fabric Wholesale Direct for sponsoring the fabric on this costume. I have been wanting to make a BeetleJuice Ball Gown for 4 or 5 years now, and what an appropriate year to make it than when we have BeetleJuice. So thank you, Fabric Wholesale Direct. I will link the materials that I've used below, and stay spooky, friends!
But it's kind of a vibe.
It's kind of a vibe.
Oh my god.
Oh my god.
BeetleJuice, no!
How what do you need to do it? BeetleJuice?
Don't.
BeetleJuice?
Kind.
Juice.
Oh.